When you think of classical Chinese poetry, the Tang Dynasty is probably the first thing that pops into your head. But the era that came next, wow. It didn't just live in that shadow, it carved out a totally new identity for itself. So let's dive into the huge, innovative, and honestly often surprising world of Song Dynasty poetry.
So just to give you a sense of the scale we're dealing with here, get this number in your head, 200,000. That is the number of poems from the Song Dynasty that we still have today, and they were written by nearly 10,000 different authors. I mean, that's just a staggering literary legacy, right?
And this chart really drives that point home. The amount of poetry that survived from the Song Dynasty is more than 4 times larger than what we have from the Tang Dynasty. And a huge reason for this explosion? It was the rise of book printing. For the first time, you could preserve and spread writing on a scale that was just unimaginable before.
But think about it. This massive output and the, towering reputation of the Tang poets who came before, that created a pretty unique challenge. How do you make your own mark? How do you create something new and distinctive when you're standing in the shadow of this literary mountain? Well, the Song poets, they had to innovate.
And innovate, they absolutely did. So in this explainer, we're going to look at the key ways they totally expanded the art form. They started finding beauty in really mundane, everyday stuff. They turned poetry into this space for intellectual debate, and they pioneered a brand new, much more direct way of talking about emotions.
All right, let's start with that first one, their new focus on the ordinary. Instead of, big epic tales or grand landscapes, song poets often looked at the small, everyday details of life. And in doing so, they created a really popular new subgenre.
This was called poems on things. And the whole point wasn't just to describe something, but to get at its very essence, its inner meaning. A perfect example of this comes from the poet Lin Bu and his super famous work on the plum blossom. This flower became a really powerful symbol for the whole scholarly class.
Okay, so these are the most celebrated lines from that poem. And what's so masterful is how indirectly he talks about the flower. He doesn't just say, hey, the plum blossom is beautiful. No, he points to its spare shadows, its hidden fragrance, the hazy and dim moon. He's capturing this feeling, this quiet, subtle beauty, and almost a sense of restraint.
And the impact of this poem was just enormous. Lin Bu basically became the guy for plum blossom poetry. His work went on to inspire centuries of visual art, especially this tradition of ink plum painting. Artists would use only black ink to try and capture that colorless elegance. It became this profound symbol of scholarly self-restraint.
But song poetry wasn't all about quiet, distant observation. And that brings us to the next big shift, how they started to explore a totally new kind of emotional expression. Something way less formal and a lot more personal and direct.
You can see this so clearly in poems about mourning. The old way of doing it was very polished, very literary, and often written way after the event happened, so there's this emotional distance. But then this poet, Mei Yaqin, he just pioneered a totally new approach. He started writing with his raw, simple language right in the immediate aftermath of his grief.
And these lines from his poem Mourning His Wife, they just showcase this new style perfectly. There are no complicated literary tricks here. It is just so disarmingly simple and so incredibly direct. What you get is a portrait of a man who is completely falling apart, who just can't cope with his loss. And his voice, it feels immediate and just devastatingly real.
All right, for our third key development, we're getting into something a little more intellectual. We're seeing poetry itself become a space for arguments and for theory. The poets weren't just writing about their feelings anymore, they were having these complex philosophical debates right there on the page.
So the great writer Su Shi, he was grappling with this central question about creativity. The old school theory was that great art had to come from these really powerful, overwhelming emotions. Sadness, worry, anxiety. But Su Shi started to wonder, is that really the only way?
And he actually argued against this old theory. Su Shi came up with this idea that emptiness and quietude, basically a calm, meditative state of mind, was an equally valid path to great art, maybe even a superior one. He believed that a calm mind could see the world more clearly. It would let the artist take in 10,000 scenes, as he put it, and create something much more balanced and profound.
Now, another poet, Wang Anshi, he had a different take on this whole intellectual poetry thing. His technique was famously described as touching iron and transforming it into gold. What he would do is take these kind of boring, functional phrases from old historical texts and then cleverly reuse them in his poems, giving them a completely new life. I mean, check out these brilliant lines. Okay, so the phrases "guards the fields" and "shove open the doorway," they were originally from these dry historical accounts about state farms and some reckless general. But look what Wang Anshi does. He totally transforms them. Suddenly, the river becomes a sentinel, a guard, and the mountains become this active force, literally shoving the doorway open. It's genius. And finally, song poets were just incredibly keen observers of the world around them. Their poetry really became a chronicle of their times, capturing everything from huge national tragedies all the way down to the tiniest details of life in the countryside.
And you can see this incredible range in just a single poet, a guy named Lu Yu, who wrote, get this, nearly 10,000 poems. So in one poem, he's expressing this deep patriotic anguish, mourning the loss of northern China to invaders. And in the very next, he's writing with this really deep appreciation for the simple, rustic beauty of the countryside. For him, both of those things were equally part of his world.
Now, one of his contemporaries, Fan Chengda, he took this kind of observation to a whole other level. He wasn't just appreciating it, he was almost documenting it. He created these remarkably unromanticized, super detailed portraits of what peasant life was actually like.
Fan Chengda's poems are just filled with these sharp, specific details. He writes about the endless work in the fields, like how the rice threshing goes on all through the night. He talks about the crushing burden of government taxes, how the grain you harvest goes to pay off debts before it can even feed your family, and how people were so exhausted from it all that there was just no time left for festivals or celebrations.
So, when you put it all together, what is the unique legacy of these Song Dynasty poets? Well, they inherited this massive grand tradition, but instead of just copying it, they really forged their own, completely new path.
I mean, they found profound meaning in everyday objects. They pioneered this direct, plain-spoken emotional style. They transformed poetry into a place for philosophical debate. And they developed this keen, realistic eye for observing the world around them, from how a farm works all the way up to the fate of the entire nation.
So in the end, the song poets did so much more than just escape the shadow of the Tang Dynasty. Yeah, they produced an incredible amount of poetry, but more importantly, they fundamentally expanded the very definition of what a poem could even be. They proved that a poem could be a philosophical argument, or a raw cry of grief, or a quiet meditation on a single flower. They created a whole new voice, and that voice, it continues to resonate.